Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the world of Greece. So turn off the lights and enjoy the history of ancient Greece. Long before Athens became the birthplace of democracy, before Spartan warriors marched into battle, and before Alexander the Great carried Greek civilization across the known world, the lands surrounding the Aegean Sea were already home to powerful and sophisticated civilizations. The story of ancient Greece did not begin with the famous city-states of the classical age. It began centuries earlier, during the Bronze Age, when wealthy kingdoms dominated the islands and mainland of the Aegean, built enormous palaces, traded across the Mediterranean, and created the foundations upon which later Greek civilization would emerge. One of the earliest of these civilizations flourished not on the Greek mainland, but on the island of Crete. Beginning around 3000 BC and reaching the height of its power during the second millennium BC, the civilization now known as the Minoans became one of the most prosperous societies in the ancient Mediterranean. Their modern name comes from the legendary King Minos, who, according to later Greek mythology, ruled Crete from the city of Knossos. Although we do not know what the Minoans called themselves, archaeological discoveries reveal a society that was remarkably advanced for its time. At the center of Minoan civilization stood enormous palace complexes, the most famous of which was located at Knossos. These were not simply royal residences. They were administrative, religious, economic, and commercial centers filled with workshops, storerooms, ceremonial chambers, and elaborate courtyards. Their walls were decorated with colorful frescoes depicting processions, animals, religious ceremonies, ships, and the famous practice of bull leaping. The scale and complexity of Knossos may even have helped inspire the later Greek legend of the labyrinth, the enormous maze in which King Minos supposedly imprisoned the monstrous Minotaur. The Minoans owed much of their prosperity to the sea. Crete occupied a strategic position between mainland Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean, allowing Minoan merchants to participate in extensive trade networks. Their ships transported pottery, olive oil, wine, textiles, and other goods across the region while returning with metals and luxury products from distant lands. Minoan influence spread throughout the Aegean, and evidence of their trade has been discovered from Egypt to the coast of Anatolia. But while Crete prospered, another civilization was emerging across the sea on the Greek mainland. Beginning around 1600 BC, powerful kingdoms developed around fortified centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. These people are now known as the Mycenaeans, named after the great fortress of Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese. The Mycenaeans differed significantly from the Minoans. Their society appears to have been more heavily militarized, and their great centers were surrounded by enormous defensive walls constructed from stone so massive that later Greeks believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have moved them. At Mycenae, visitors entered the citadel through the monumental Lion Gate, while inside stood royal buildings, storerooms, workshops, and tombs containing extraordinary quantities of weapons, jewelry, and gold. Mycenaean society was ruled by powerful kings known as wannachs. Beneath them existed a hierarchy of officials, warriors, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers whose activities were carefully recorded by palace administrators. These records were written in a script called Linear B. When the script was finally deciphered in the 20th century, researchers made an extraordinary discovery. The language recorded on the tablets was an early form of Greek. This meant that the Mycenaeans were not merely predecessors who happened to occupy Greece before the classical Greeks. They were themselves Greek speakers, pushing the documented history of the Greek language back centuries. As Mycenaean power expanded, their influence spread throughout the Aegean. By around the 15th century BC, Minoan political dominance had weakened, possibly as a result of natural disasters, internal instability, or growing Mycenaean power. Mycenaean elites eventually gained control over Knossos and adopted many elements of Minoan culture, including aspects of art, religion, administration, and trade. The Aegean world was increasingly dominated by mainland Greek kingdoms. These kingdoms were connected by language and culture, but Greece was not a unified country. Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and other centers were separate political powers, each ruled by its own elite. They competed for wealth and influence, while participating in a wider network of diplomacy, warfare, and trade that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean merchants and warriors traveled far beyond Greece, interacting with powerful civilizations such as Egypt and the Hittite Empire. It was within this warrior culture that some of the most famous legends of ancient Greece may have originated. Centuries later, Greek poets told stories of a great expedition against the city of Troy, led by legendary kings and warriors such as Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, and Menelaus. The most famous version survives in Homer's Iliad, composed long after the Bronze Age itself had ended. Archaeological evidence confirms that a major settlement existed at Troy in northwestern Anatolia, and that it suffered repeated destruction, although whether a single Trojan War occurred exactly as later Greeks remembered it remains uncertain. What matters is that the memory of the Mycenaean world survived. Later, Greeks looked back upon the Bronze Age as a heroic era when larger-than-life warriors fought enormous battles and kings ruled from mighty citadels. Mycenaean ruins scattered across Greece became physical reminders of this vanished past, while stories that may once have been rooted in real conflicts gradually transformed into mythology. Yet at the height of their power, few could have imagined how quickly this world would disappear. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean entered one of the most mysterious and destructive periods in ancient history. Cities were burned, international trade networks collapsed, and some of the greatest kingdoms of the Bronze Age vanished within generations. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Major cities across the Levant were destroyed. Egypt survived only after fighting off repeated invasions. The Mycenaean kingdoms would not escape. One after another, their great palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. Mycenae declined. Pylos burned. The administrative system that had maintained these kingdoms disappeared, and with it vanished the Linear B writing system that had recorded the earliest known form of Greek. The magnificent palace civilization of Bronze Age Greece had come to an end. But the Greek people had not. From the ruins of the Mycenaean world, Greece would enter a long period of decline and transformation. Populations would shrink, settlements would disappear, trade would diminish, and writing would be forgotten. For centuries, Greece would exist in the shadow of its former greatness, and yet, within this age of collapse, the foundations of an entirely new Greek civilization were beginning to form. Around 1200 BC, the world of the Eastern Mediterranean began to unravel. For centuries, the great powers of the Bronze Age had been connected through an enormous network of trade, diplomacy, migration, and warfare. Mycenaean kings ruled from fortified palaces across Greece. The Hittite Empire controlled much of Anatolia. Egypt remained one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, while prosperous cities along the Eastern Mediterranean linked these civilizations together. Bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, depended on long-distance trade, because its primary ingredients, copper and tin, often had to be transported across vast distances. The great kingdoms of the period had grown wealthy within this interconnected system, but that same interdependence also made them vulnerable. Then, within only a few generations, much of this world collapsed. The exact causes of the Bronze Age collapse remain debated. There was probably no single disaster responsible. Instead, several crises may have struck at roughly the same time. Archaeological evidence suggests that drought and food shortages affected parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Earthquakes may have damaged important settlements. Internal rebellions and political instability weakened kingdoms from within, while warfare and population movements placed additional pressure on already fragile states. Egyptian records also describe attacks by mysterious groups later called the Sea Peoples, who appeared across the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Whether these groups caused the collapse or were themselves displaced by it remains uncertain. Whatever the exact combination of events, the consequences were enormous. The Hittite Empire disappeared, Cities along the coast of the Levant were destroyed or abandoned. Egypt survived, but its power weakened dramatically. Across Greece, the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. At Pylos, the great palace was destroyed by fire. Other major centers, including Mycenaean Tiryns, suffered destruction and decline. The elaborate bureaucracies that had controlled agriculture, trade, taxation, and military organization disappeared. The kings who had once ruled from these massive citadels vanished from the historical record. Most dramatically, the Linear B writing system disappeared with them. For the next several centuries, there are no surviving written records from Greece. The age of the Mycenaean kings was over. The centuries that followed have traditionally been called the Greek Dark Ages, beginning around 1100 BC and continuing until roughly 800 BC. The name does not mean that Greek civilization completely disappeared. Instead, it reflects both the decline visible in the archaeological record and the absence of written sources. Compared with the wealthy palace civilization that had preceded it, Greece became poorer, less populated, and more isolated. Many settlements shrank or were abandoned entirely. Long-distance trade declined dramatically. Monumental architecture became rare, and the sophisticated palace economy of the Mycenaean period disappeared. Communities became smaller and more localized. Instead of powerful kings controlling large territories from fortified centers, political authority appears to have become increasingly fragmented. Greece itself encouraged this fragmentation. Mountain ranges divided the mainland into valleys and plains, separated by difficult terrain, while hundreds of islands were scattered across the Aegean Sea. Without a powerful central authority, communities developed independently from one another. This geographic isolation would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of Greek civilization. Greece would not develop as a single, unified kingdom like Egypt. Instead, hundreds of independent communities would emerge, each with its own government, laws, traditions, and identity. Yet the Dark Ages were not simply centuries of decline. They were also centuries of transformation. One major change was the increasing use of iron. Bronze required both copper and tin, materials dependent on trade routes that had been severely disrupted during the collapse. Iron ore, by contrast, was more widely available. Early iron weapons were not automatically superior to the finest bronze weapons, but improvements in ironworking gradually made the metal increasingly important. Over time, iron tools and weapons became common throughout Greece, marking the beginning of the Greek Iron Age. The political structure of Greek society was also changing. The powerful one-axe kings of the Mycenaean age had disappeared, but smaller-scale leaders remained. Some communities were ruled by local chiefs, or kings known as basileis. Their power was far more limited than that of the Bronze Age monarchs. Instead of commanding vast palace bureaucracies, these leaders depended heavily on personal wealth, military ability, family connections, and the support of local elites. Warrior culture remained extremely important. Status could be earned through courage in battle, generosity toward followers, and the accumulation of wealth and prestige. These values would later appear throughout Greek heroic literature. The warriors of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey fight for honor, glory, wealth, and reputation. Although the stories were set in the distant age of Mycenaean kings, many aspects of the society described by Homer may reflect traditions that developed during the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. The memory of the Mycenaean world had never entirely disappeared. Stories of legendary kings, heroes, monsters, and wars were passed orally from generation to generation. Tales of Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, and Odysseus survived long after the palaces associated with their supposed age had fallen into ruin. With no writing system available, poets preserved these stories through performance, memorization, and repetition. Over centuries, historical memories mixed with mythology until the world of Bronze Age Greece became the heroic age of Greek legend. Gradually, conditions began to improve. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the Greek population was growing again. Settlements expanded, agricultural production increased, and contact with the wider Mediterranean intensified. Greek merchants and sailors once again traveled across the sea, encountering peoples whose cultures would influence Greece's development. Among the most important were the Phoenicians, the great sailors and merchants of the eastern Mediterranean. Through contact with them, the Greeks encountered a writing system based on a relatively small number of symbols representing sounds. Sometime around the 8th century BC, the Greeks adapted this Phoenician alphabet to their own language. They made an enormously important innovation by modifying certain symbols to represent vowel sounds, helping create the ancestor of the alphabet eventually inherited by the Romans and, through them, many modern European languages. After centuries without writing, Greece could once again record its language. The return of literacy transformed Greek civilization. Laws could eventually be written down. Commercial transactions could be recorded. Religious dedications could be inscribed. Most importantly for Greek culture, the great oral traditions that had survived the Dark Ages could eventually be preserved in written form. Around this period, the epic poems associated with Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, began taking the forms through which they would become two of the most influential works in Western literature. Meanwhile, Greek communities were becoming larger and increasingly organized. Population growth created pressure for more farmland. Trade produced new sources of wealth. Powerful families competed for political influence. Religious sanctuaries began attracting worshippers from different regions, helping create a shared sense of Greek identity, even as individual communities remained fiercely independent. One of the most important of these sanctuaries developed at Olympia in the western Peloponnese. Traditionally dated to 776 BC, the Olympic Games brought Greeks together in honor of Zeus. Competitors arrived from different communities to participate in athletic contests, demonstrating that although the Greeks remained politically divided, they increasingly recognized that they shared certain gods, customs, myths, and a common language. Other sanctuaries became important as well. At Delphi, Greeks traveled to consult the oracle of Apollo. Religious festivals, athletic competitions, and shared mythology created connections across the Greek world. A man from Sparta and a man from Athens might consider themselves citizens of rival communities, but both could still recognize themselves as Greek. At the same time, the old villages and settlements of Greece were developing into something entirely new. Communities increasingly organized themselves around urban centers and their surrounding countryside. Public spaces became more important. Temples were constructed. Political institutions became more sophisticated. Citizens began participating in the affairs of their communities in ways that would eventually distinguish Greek society from the monarchies surrounding it. This new form of political community became known as the polis, or city-state. Each polis was independent. Each could make its own laws, raise its own army, worship particular patron gods, and wage war against its neighbors. Some would be ruled by kings, others by aristocrats. Some would fall under the control of tyrants. And eventually, one would experiment with an extraordinary new system in which citizens themselves participated directly in government. From the darkness that followed the Bronze Age collapse, Greece was emerging transformed. The great palace kingdoms were gone. There would be no new Mycenaean empire controlling the Greek mainland. Instead, hundreds of fiercely independent city-states would compete against one another for land, wealth, prestige, and power. That competition would become both Greece's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. And from these city-states would emerge two names that would come to dominate the story of ancient Greece: Athens and Sparta. By the 8th century BC, Greece was emerging from centuries of isolation and decline. Populations were increasing, trade routes were reopening, writing had returned, and communities that had once been little more than scattered villages were growing into organized political centers. But unlike the great civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greece would not unite beneath a single king. Instead, its mountains, valleys, islands, and coastlines gave rise to hundreds of independent states. The Greeks called these communities polis, the plural of polis. Today they are usually described as city-states, although a polis was more than simply a city. It included an urban center along with the surrounding villages, farmland, religious sanctuaries, and countryside controlled by its citizens. Each polis functioned almost like an independent country. It possessed its own laws, government, army, religious traditions, and political identity. There was no single government of ancient Greece. A person was first and foremost an Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian, or Theban. These communities could form alliances and recognize similarities in language, religion, and culture, but they also competed fiercely with one another. Wars between Greek city-states would become common, and political rivalries would shape Greek history for centuries. At the heart of many city-states stood the Acropolis, a fortified high point that could contain important temples and provide protection during an attack. Below it often stood the Agora, an open public space that became the center of commercial and political life. Merchants sold goods, craftsmen worked nearby, citizens exchanged news, and political discussions took place. The polis was therefore not merely where Greeks lived, it increasingly became the center of their identity. This political world was undergoing major changes. During the Dark Ages, many communities had been dominated by kings or local chiefs. Over time, however, royal power weakened in much of Greece. Wealthy landowning families gained influence, and many city-states became aristocracies or oligarchies controlled by a relatively small group of powerful families. But as Greece became wealthier, new groups began demanding greater influence. Trade expanded dramatically during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Greek merchants traveled across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, bringing home grain, metals, luxury goods, and new ideas. Craftsmen produced pottery, weapons, textiles, and other products for increasingly distant markets. Wealth was no longer tied exclusively to ownership of large estates. Successful merchants and craftsmen could accumulate fortunes of their own, challenging the traditional dominance of the old aristocratic families. Population growth created another problem. Greece possessed limited amounts of fertile farmland, and as communities expanded, competition for land intensified. Beginning around the 8th century BC, Greek city-states responded by establishing settlements far beyond the Aegean. Greek colonies appeared along the coast of southern Italy and Sicily, an area that would eventually contain so many Greek communities that the Romans called it Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. Other settlements appeared along the coast of modern France and Spain, in North Africa, around the Black Sea, and along the shores of Anatolia. These colonies were usually independent communities rather than territories directly governed by their founding cities. Yet they maintained cultural and religious connections with the Greek world. Through colonization, Greek language, pottery, architecture, religion, and customs spread across much of the Mediterranean. The Greeks, in turn, absorbed influences from the peoples they encountered. They adopted and adapted the Phoenician alphabet. Artistic styles were influenced by Egypt and the Near East. New commercial networks brought Greek merchants into contact with some of the wealthiest civilizations of the ancient world. As wealth and population grew, warfare changed as well. The defining Greek soldier of this period became the hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman equipped with a large round shield, spear, helmet, and body armor. Hoplites fought together in dense formations that later became known as the phalanx. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, while rows of spears projected toward the enemy. Success depended on discipline and cooperation. A warrior could no longer fight effectively as an isolated hero seeking personal glory. He depended on the men standing beside him, while they depended on him to maintain the formation. If part of the line broke, the entire formation could be placed in danger. The growth of hoplite warfare may also have contributed to political change. Many hoplites were farmers who possessed enough wealth to purchase their own equipment. Because these citizens were expected to defend the polis in battle, they had a powerful argument for having a voice in how that polis was governed. Across Greece, political power gradually became the subject of increasingly intense conflict. In some city-states, These tensions produced rulers known as tyrants. The word has a much more negative meaning today, but in archaic Greece, it originally referred to someone who seized power outside the traditional political system. Some tyrants were brutal, while others were popular leaders who weakened aristocratic families, supported public building projects, encouraged trade, and gained the backing of ordinary citizens. No single political system dominated Greece. Some city-states remained oligarchies, others experienced tyranny. Some retained kings in limited roles. Different communities experimented with different ways of distributing power. This political experimentation would eventually produce radically different societies. At Sparta, the need to control conquered territory would help create one of the most militarized societies in history. Spartan citizens would dedicate themselves to warfare, discipline, and obedience, supported by a vast population forced to work the land beneath them. Athens would travel down a different path. Conflict between aristocrats and ordinary citizens would lead to reforms that gradually expanded political participation. After generations of instability, Athens would eventually create a system the Greeks called democratia, rule by the people. But despite their differences, the city-states shared important cultural bonds. Greeks worshipped many of the same gods. Zeus ruled from Mount Olympus alongside deities such as Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, Hera, Artemis, Aphrodite, and Ares. Every polis had its own religious traditions and patron gods, but sanctuaries such as Delphi and Olympia attracted visitors from across the Greek world. Religion was woven into almost every aspect of Greek life. Festivals honored the gods, sacrifices accompanied major public events, and rulers and generals sought divine guidance before important decisions. At Delphi, the Oracle of Apollo became one of the most prestigious religious authorities in the Greek world. Cities, kings, and eventually foreign rulers traveled enormous distances to seek the oracle's advice. Athletic competitions also helped connect the divided Greek world. The Olympic Games brought athletes from different city-states together to compete in honor of Zeus. Other Panhellenic festivals offered contests in athletics, music, poetry, and chariot racing. Victories brought enormous prestige, not only to individual competitors, but also to the cities they represented. The Greeks were therefore developing a remarkable contradiction. Politically, they remained deeply divided. Culturally, they increasingly recognized themselves as members of a broader Greek world. They shared language, mythology, religious practices, heroic traditions, and memories of a legendary past. The poems associated with Homer told stories that could be understood from one end of the Greek world to the other. Achilles, Odysseus, and the heroes of Troy belong not to one city-state, but to a shared Greek cultural inheritance. Yet this shared identity rarely prevented Greeks from fighting one another. Competition became deeply embedded in Greek society. City competed against city. Aristocratic families competed for political influence. Athletes competed for glory. Poets competed at festivals. Warriors competed for honor. Even the monumental temples built by wealthy city-states could serve as demonstrations of their power and prestige. This intense rivalry encouraged innovation, but it also ensured that Greece remained politically fractured. By the beginning of the 6th century BC, hundreds of poleis stretched across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Among them were wealthy trading powers such as Corinth, important cities such as Thebes and Argos, and Greek communities along the coast of Anatolia. But two city-states would eventually tower above the others. One was Sparta, located in the fertile valley of the Eurotas River in the southern Peloponnese. Through conquest, its citizens would transform their society into a military system unlike anything else in Greece. The other was Athens, centered on the region of Attica. Its people would embark upon a turbulent political experiment that eventually produced the ancient world's most famous democracy. Their cultures, governments, and values would be dramatically different, and eventually, their rivalry would tear the Greek world apart. Among the hundreds of city-states that emerged across ancient Greece, none developed a society quite like Sparta. Located in the region of Laconia in the southern Peloponnese, Sparta would become famous throughout the ancient world for discipline, military strength, and the extraordinary demands it placed upon its citizens. While other Greek cities became known for trade, philosophy, art, or democracy, Sparta built its identity around one overriding purpose: producing warriors capable of defending and controlling the state. Sparta had not always been this way. During the early centuries of Greek history, it was one of many developing communities scattered across the Peloponnese. But between roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Spartans expanded beyond their homeland and conquered neighboring territory, most importantly, the fertile region of Messenia to the west. The conquest gave Sparta control over some of the richest agricultural land in Greece, but it also created a dangerous problem. The conquered population vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens who ruled them. Many of these conquered people became known as helots. They were an unfree population tied to the land who were required to provide a substantial portion of their agricultural production to Spartan masters. Unlike ordinary chattel slaves, who might belong directly to individual owners, the helots occupied a distinctive position within the Spartan system and were essential to its survival. They farmed the land and performed much of the labor that allowed male Spartan citizens to devote themselves to military training. But the helots were also a constant threat. The Messenians had not simply forgotten their independence, and resistance to Spartan rule could be fierce. A major helot revolt in the 7th century BC, traditionally associated with the Second Messenian War, appears to have had a profound impact on Spartan society. Surrounded by a large population that could potentially rebel, the Spartans increasingly organized their entire state around military preparedness and internal control. At the top of this society stood the Spartiates, the full male citizens of Sparta. Citizenship was not simply something a Spartan received by birth and kept automatically. A man had to pass through the Spartan educational system, participate in communal institutions, maintain his economic obligations, and remain part of the military community. Failure could mean the loss of full status. Below the Spartiots were the Perioikoi, or dwellers around. They lived in communities throughout Spartan-controlled territory and were personally free, but lacked full Spartan political rights. They played important roles as craftsmen, merchants, sailors, and soldiers. Beneath them were the helots, whose agricultural labor supported the entire system. This social structure made possible one of the ancient world's most famous systems of education and military training, the agoge. At around the age of 7, Spartan boys entered a state-supervised system designed to prepare them for the demands of citizenship and warfare. They were organized into groups, trained physically, taught discipline, and expected to endure hardship. Exercise, competition, obedience, and military preparation became central parts of their upbringing. Ancient accounts emphasize that boys were given limited comforts and encouraged to become resourceful, although some later stories about Spartan training were probably exaggerated as Sparta's reputation became legendary. The objective was not merely to create individually powerful fighters. Sparta needed men who would maintain discipline even under extreme pressure. Greek warfare depended heavily on the hoplite phalanx, where soldiers stood tightly packed together and each man's survival depended partly on the discipline of those around him. A warrior who abandoned his position could endanger the entire formation. For Sparta, courage therefore meant more than reckless aggression. It meant remaining in formation, obeying orders, and placing the survival of the community above the individual. Spartan military life continued into adulthood. Full citizens joined communal dining groups known as syssitia, where men regularly ate together and reinforced the bonds that connected them as soldiers and citizens. Military service remained central to a Spartan man's identity for much of his life. Spartan women also occupied an unusual position compared with women in many other Greek city-states. Because male citizens spent so much time involved in military activities, Spartan women could exercise considerable responsibility over households and property. Girls received physical training, and women could own and inherit property to a degree that surprised other Greeks. Spartan society believed that physically strong women would produce strong children, reflecting how deeply the military priorities of the state shaped even family life. Sparta's government was equally unusual. Rather than having a single monarch, Sparta maintained two kings simultaneously, drawn from separate royal families. The kings served important religious and military functions, and one could lead Spartan armies on campaign. But their authority was limited by other institutions. A council of elders, even known as the Gerousia, consisted of 28 men over the age of 60, along with the two kings. It played a major role in political decision-making and prepared measures that could be presented to the citizen assembly. The assembly, composed of eligible male Spartan citizens, could vote on important matters, though its powers were more restricted than those of the democratic assembly that would later develop in Athens. Perhaps most distinctive were the 5 officials known as ephors, elected annually. They possessed significant authority and could supervise many aspects of Spartan public life, including the conduct of the kings themselves. The result was a mixed political system combining monarchy, oligarchy, and a limited citizen assembly. The Spartan system proved remarkably effective at producing military power. By the 6th century BC, Sparta had become the dominant state in the Peloponnese. Yet rather than directly conquering every neighboring city, it increasingly relied on alliances. Sparta became the leader of what modern historians call the Peloponnesian League, a network of states that recognized Spartan military leadership while generally retaining their own governments. This made Sparta one of the most powerful forces in Greece. Its reputation became almost as important as its army. Other Greeks admired and feared Spartan discipline. Spartan citizens were expected to avoid excessive luxury and display, and their society became associated with austerity and simplicity. Even today, the word Spartan describes something severe or lacking unnecessary comfort. But beneath this image of strength were serious weaknesses. The entire Spartan system depended upon the labor and continued submission of the helots. The fear of rebellion never completely disappeared. Sparta therefore had to devote enormous attention not only to foreign enemies, but also to maintaining control at home. Even more damaging in the long term was the declining number of full Spartan citizens. Citizenship requirements were demanding, and those unable to maintain their economic contributions could lose status. Over generations, land and wealth became increasingly concentrated, while the number of men eligible to serve as full citizens declined. Sparta's military system demanded an elite citizen body, yet that citizen body became progressively smaller. For the moment, however, these weaknesses were hidden beneath Sparta's growing reputation. By the early 5th century BC, the Spartans were widely regarded as some of the finest hoplite soldiers in Greece. Their armies were disciplined, experienced, and capable of coordinating large forces drawn from their allies. When Greek states faced a major land war, Sparta was the obvious power to lead them. Soon, Greece would face a threat unlike the constant wars between rival city-states. Across the Aegean Sea, an enormous empire was expanding westward. The Persian Empire had conquered kingdoms from Central Asia to Egypt and had absorbed the Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia. Its resources and manpower dwarfed anything the divided Greek states could command. When Persia eventually turned its attention toward mainland Greece, the Spartans would be called upon to defend it. And at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a Spartan king and his warriors would create one of the most famous last stands in history. But Sparta would not face Persia alone. To the northeast, another city-state was undergoing a very different transformation. Instead of organizing its society around a permanent warrior elite, Athens was confronting inequality, political conflict, and the power of its aristocracy. From that struggle would emerge an idea that would change political history forever: democracy. While Sparta was transforming itself into the most feared military state in Greece, another city was following a very different path. On the rocky peninsula of Attica stood Athens, a city that would eventually become famous for philosophy, architecture, theatre, and political experimentation. But the democracy for which Athens is remembered did not emerge peacefully or all at once. It developed over generations of social conflict, economic crisis, tyranny, reform, and struggles between powerful aristocratic families and ordinary citizens. Like many Greek city-states, early Athens had once been ruled by kings. Over time, however, royal authority faded, and political power passed into the hands of wealthy aristocratic families. These elites controlled much of the best farmland, dominated important offices, and exercised enormous influence over the legal system. For poorer Athenians, life could be precarious. Farmers who borrowed money and failed to repay their debts could lose their land, and in some circumstances, debt could threaten their personal freedom. By the beginning of the 6th century BC, these tensions were becoming dangerous. Athens faced the possibility of severe internal conflict between rich and poor. The city needed reform, and around 594 BC, the Athenians entrusted extraordinary authority to a statesman named Solon. Solon attempted to prevent revolution without completely destroying the aristocratic system. Among his most important measures was the cancellation of certain debts and the abolition of debt bondage for Athenian citizens. Athenians who had fallen into slavery because of debt could be freed, and the ability of creditors to use a citizen's person as security for a loan was ended. Solon also reorganized aspects of political participation according to wealth rather than simply aristocratic birth. The richest citizens still possessed the greatest access to high office, but political influence was no longer reserved exclusively for members of the oldest noble families. Lower classes gained a greater role in institutions such as the assembly and popular courts. It was not democracy, as later generations would understand it, but it weakened the aristocracy's monopoly on political power. Solon's reforms failed to solve every problem. Inequality remained. Factions continued competing for control, and Athens eventually fell under the rule of a tyrant named Pisistratus. The word tyrant did not yet necessarily mean a cruel dictator. In the Greek world, it referred primarily to someone who seized power outside the traditional constitutional order. Pisistratus took control of Athens in the 6th century BC and, despite periods of exile, eventually established himself securely as ruler. His government preserved many existing institutions while strengthening the city economically and culturally. Athens expanded its influence, public works were encouraged, religious festivals gained greater prominence, and the city became increasingly prosperous. After Pisistratus died, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited power. Their rule would not last. In 514 BC, Hipparchus was assassinated. Hippias survived, but his government became increasingly suspicious and harsh. In 510 BC, with Spartan intervention helping his opponents, Hippias was driven from Athens. The fall of the tyranny created a struggle over who would control the city next. One of the leading figures was the aristocrat Cleisthenes. Facing a powerful rival and seeking broader support, Cleisthenes turned toward the Athenian population and introduced reforms that fundamentally reshaped the political system. Beginning in 508 and 507 BC, Cleisthenes reorganized Athenian citizens into new political units designed partly to weaken the power of traditional aristocratic families and regional factions. Citizens from the city, coast, and interior were combined within a new tribal structure, making it harder for powerful local families to dominate politics through old networks of loyalty. A new council of 500 was created, with 50 members drawn from each of 10 tribes. The council helped prepare business for the citizen assembly and managed important aspects of government. Participation in political life became broader, while the assembly itself grew increasingly important. From these reforms emerged the foundations of what the Athenians called democratia, the rule or power of the demos, the people. Athenian democracy was radically different from most modern representative democracies. Citizens did not primarily elect politicians to make decisions for them. Instead, eligible male citizens could participate directly in the assembly, where they debated and voted on matters ranging from laws and finances to diplomacy and war. Many public offices were eventually filled by lot rather than election. To the Athenians, randomly selecting officials from the citizen body could help prevent wealthy individuals from monopolizing power. Certain positions requiring specialized experience, especially military commands, continued to be elected. The system was extraordinarily participatory by ancient standards, but it was also deeply limited. The political category of citizen represented only part of the population of Attica. Women could not participate in the assembly or hold political office. Enslaved people possessed no political rights. Foreign residents, known as metics, could play major roles in the Athenian economy, but were excluded from citizenship. Athenian democracy therefore gave significant political power to its male citizen body, while excluding a large portion of the people who actually lived and worked within the city. Even with these limitations, the idea that ordinary citizens could collectively make major decisions of state was remarkable in a world dominated by kings, aristocracies, and empires. Athens also developed mechanisms intended to prevent individuals from becoming too powerful. One of the most famous was ostracism. In certain years, citizens could vote to exile a prominent individual from Athens for 10 years. The person generally retained his property and was not necessarily accused of a crime. Ostracism was instead a political safeguard that could remove someone considered dangerously influential. Meanwhile, Athens itself was changing rapidly. Its location near the Aegean made maritime trade increasingly important. The nearby port facilities at Piraeus would eventually connect Athens to commercial routes stretching across the Mediterranean. Pottery produced in Attica became highly valued and was exported throughout the Greek world and beyond. Silver mines at Lorient provided another major source of wealth. Athens was becoming richer, more populous, and increasingly ambitious. Yet democracy remained fragile. Powerful aristocrats continued to play major roles in politics, and the reforms of Cleisthenes were still relatively new. No one could know whether this experiment in citizen government would survive a serious crisis. That crisis soon arrived from across the Aegean. During the 6th century BC, the Persian Empire had expanded with extraordinary speed. Founded by Cyrus the Great, it grew into the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, stretching from Central Asia and the Indus Valley to Egypt and the shores of the Aegean. Its kings ruled over dozens of peoples and commanded resources on a scale no Greek city-state could hope to match. Persian expansion brought the empire into direct contact with the Greek cities of Ionia along the western coast of Anatolia. These Greek communities had fallen under Persian rule, generally governing their local affairs while ultimately answering to the great king. In 499 BC, several Ionian cities revolted. The rebels sought assistance from mainland Greece. Sparta declined to become deeply involved, but Athens agreed to send ships, joined by the city of Eretria. Athenian forces participated in an expedition that advanced inland and helped burn parts of Sardis, an important Persian administrative center. The revolt ultimately failed. Persian forces gradually regained control, and by 494 BC, the rebellion had been crushed. But Athens had now attracted the attention of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. According to later Greek tradition, King Darius I was determined to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting the rebellion. Persian expansion into the Aegean also made confrontation with mainland Greece increasingly likely, regardless of personal revenge. In 490 BC, a Persian expedition crossed the Aegean. Eretria was captured and destroyed. The Persian force then sailed toward Attica and landed on the plain of Marathon, only a short distance from Athens. The Athenians now faced a terrifying decision. They could remain behind their walls and risk siege. They could submit to Persia, or they could march out and confront an imperial army whose king ruled over territories vastly larger and wealthier than their own city-state. Sparta might have been Greece's greatest military power, but there was no Spartan army standing beside the Athenians at Marathon. Athens would have to fight. For the young democracy, the coming battle would be more than a struggle for territory. It would be a struggle for survival. In 490 BC, the Persian army stood on the plain of Marathon, roughly 26 miles northeast of Athens. Behind it lay the ships that had carried Persian forces across the Aegean. Ahead stood one of the last major obstacles to Persian domination of the region: Athens. The empire ruled by Darius I possessed resources far beyond anything a single Greek city-state could command. Yet the Athenians chose to meet the invasion in open battle. The Athenian army marched to Marathon and was joined by a small force from the nearby city of Plataea. Sparta had been asked for assistance, but according to the Greek historian Herodotus, religious obligations delayed its army. The Athenians therefore faced the Persians largely on their own. Command decisions were heavily influenced by the Athenian general Miltiades, who understood that waiting indefinitely could make the situation worse. The Persians might sail directly toward Athens, while political divisions within the city created fears that sympathizers could help the invaders. The Greeks needed a decisive victory. When battle began, the Athenian hoplites advanced across the plain toward the Persian line. The Greek army had strengthened its wings while leaving its center comparatively thin. The Persian center pushed back the Greeks facing it, but on the flanks, the heavily armed Greek hoplites defeated their opponents. The victorious wings then turned inward against the Persian center. The Persian formation collapsed. Survivors fled toward their ships as the Greeks pursued them. Herodotus later claimed that thousands of Persians were killed compared with fewer than 200 Athenians, though ancient casualty figures should always be treated cautiously. What mattered was the result. The Persian expedition had been defeated. Marathon became one of the defining victories in Athenian history. The battle demonstrated that Persian forces were not invincible and gave Athens enormous confidence. It also ensured that the young democratic state survived its first great external test. But the Persian threat had not disappeared. Darius began preparations for another campaign, but rebellions elsewhere in the empire, and his death in 486 BC, delayed the invasion. The task passed to his son, Xerxes I. Unlike the expedition to Marathon, the next Persian campaign would not simply punish Athens. Xerxes prepared a massive invasion intended to bring mainland Greece under Persian control. The Greeks had years to prepare, and in Athens one politician recognized that the coming war might ultimately be decided at sea. His name was Themistocles. Athens had discovered rich deposits of silver at Laurion. Rather than distribute the profits among the citizens, Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to invest heavily in a fleet of warships. The vessel at the heart of Greek naval warfare was the trireme, a fast galley powered by rows of oarsmen and equipped with a bronze ram designed to strike enemy ships. Athens built roughly 200 triremes, transforming itself into the greatest naval power among the Greek city-states. The decision would prove crucial. In 480 BC, Xerxes launched his invasion. The scale of the Persian force became legendary. Herodotus provided enormous numbers that modern historians generally consider exaggerated, but there is little doubt that the Persian army and fleet represented a massive military undertaking. Soldiers were drawn from across the empire, while ships transported supplies and supported the army's movement along the coast. To move from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered enormous pontoon bridges constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow waterway separating Anatolia from Europe. Persian engineers also cut a canal through the Athos Peninsula, avoiding waters where an earlier Persian fleet had suffered disaster. The message was unmistakable. Persia had returned with overwhelming force. The Greek city-states now confronted a problem that had haunted them throughout their history: division. Some communities chose to submit to Persia. Others attempted to remain neutral. Long-standing rivalries made cooperation difficult, but a coalition of states decided to resist. Sparta, with its unmatched military reputation, took the leading role on land. Athens provided the core of the naval force. For perhaps the first time on such a scale, rival Greek states prepared to fight together against a common enemy. Their first major defensive position was eventually established at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass through which the Persian army would have to advance into central Greece. The geography offered the defenders an opportunity. In confined terrain, Persian numbers would be less decisive, while heavily armed Greek hoplites could hold a narrow front. The Greek force sent to Thermopylae numbered several thousand men from multiple city-states. At its head was the Spartan king Leonidas, and a picked force of 300 Spartan citizens. The famous 300 were therefore only one part of a much larger Greek army, although their role would become legendary. At approximately the same time, Greek warships positioned themselves near Artemisium to prevent the Persian fleet from simply bypassing the defenders by sea. Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae and initially waited, apparently expecting the Greeks to withdraw. They did not. The Persians attacked. Wave after wave of troops advanced into the narrow pass, where the terrain limited their ability to exploit superior numbers. Greek hoplites possessed large shields, long spears, heavy armor, and extensive experience fighting in close formation. The Spartans, in particular, demonstrated the discipline for which they had become famous. Persian forces suffered heavily. Even elite troops, traditionally known as the Immortals, failed to break the Greek position. For 2 days, the defenders held. Then the situation changed. A local Greek named Ephialtes revealed to the Persians a mountain path that could take troops around the Greek position. Xerxes sent forces along the route, and the defenders soon learned that they were about to be surrounded. Leonidas dismissed much of the Greek army, though exactly why different contingents departed remains debated. He remained with his 300 Spartans, along with troops including hundreds of Thespians who chose to stay, and Thebans whose circumstances are less clear in the sources. They knew the position could no longer be held. On the final day, the remaining Greeks fought until their formation was overwhelmed. Leonidas was killed. The Spartans and Thespians continued fighting as Persian forces closed around them, and the last defenders were eventually destroyed. Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The road into central Greece was open, yet the battle became one of the most famous defeats in military history. Leonidas and his men came to symbolize obedience to duty, sacrifice, and resistance against overwhelming odds. A later monument commemorated the Spartans with a message traditionally translated, "Stranger, tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws." But the popular legend of 300 Spartans single-handedly defending Greece hides the larger reality. Thousands of other Greeks fought at Thermopylae, and the campaign itself had not been decided there. The battle delayed the Persian advance, but Xerxes still possessed an enormous army, while his fleet remained a threat at sea. After Thermopylae, the Persians advanced south. Athens was now exposed. The Athenians faced a devastating choice. Defending the city itself against Xerxes' army appeared impossible. Guided by Themistocles and relying on the fleet they had constructed years earlier, the Athenians evacuated much of their population to nearby islands and other safe locations. Persian forces entered Athens. The Acropolis was attacked. Temples were destroyed. Much of the city was burned. For the Athenians who watched from across the water, the sight must have seemed like catastrophe. Their homes had been abandoned. Their sacred places had been desecrated. The city that had defeated Persia at Marathon was now occupied by the great king's army. Yet Athens was not defeated. Its true strength was floating offshore. Themistocles understood that the Persian invasion depended heavily on its fleet. The enormous Persian army required supplies, and naval control allowed Xerxes to operate along the Greek coastline. If the Persian fleet could be destroyed, the invasion itself would become far more dangerous. Near the island of Salamis, Themistocles saw his opportunity. Once again, the Greeks would attempt to use narrow terrain to neutralize Persia's numerical advantage. But this time, the battle would not be fought by hoplites standing shoulder to shoulder. It would be fought aboard hundreds of wooden warships in the confined waters outside a ruined Athens, and the survival of Greece would depend upon the result. In 480 BC, Athens lay in ruins. The Persian army had broken through the Greek defense at Thermopylae, marched into Attica, and captured the city. Temples on the Acropolis had been destroyed, homes had been burned, and much of the Athenian population had been evacuated. From the outside, it appeared that Xerxes was on the verge of achieving what his father had failed to accomplish 10 years earlier. But the Greek resistance had not been destroyed. Its most powerful weapon remained intact: the fleet. The Greek warships gathered near the island of Salamis, separated from the mainland by narrow channels. The coalition remained divided over what to do next. Some commanders favored withdrawing south to defend the Peloponnese, where Greek forces were preparing defenses near the Isthmus of Corinth. Themistocles, however, understood that abandoning Salamis could be disastrous. The Greek fleet was composed of ships from numerous independent city-states, and retreat increased the danger that the alliance would fragment. More importantly, the confined waters around Salamis offered exactly the conditions the Greeks needed. In open water, the larger Persian fleet could exploit its numbers. Inside the narrow straits, that advantage would be reduced. According to Herodotus, Themistocles resorted to deception. He secretly sent a messenger to Xerxes, claiming that the Greeks were preparing to escape. If the Persians moved quickly, the message suggested, They could surround the Greek fleet and destroy it before it fled. Xerxes took the bait. During the night, Persian ships moved into position around Salamis. Instead of trapping a retreating enemy, they entered the confined waters where the Greeks intended to fight. The following morning, the Greek fleet advanced. The waters erupted into chaos. Hundreds of triremes crowded into the straits. These ships carried marines and archers, but their primary weapon was the bronze-covered ram projecting from the bow. Skilled crews attempted to smash into the sides of enemy vessels, disable their oars, or maneuver into positions where opposing ships could be boarded. The narrow battlefield worked against the Persians. Their ships struggled to maneuver effectively, and vessels advancing from behind added to the congestion. The Greeks, operating closer to friendly shores and fighting in more manageable formations, struck the Persian line. Athenian ships formed the largest contingent of the Greek fleet, while other city-states, including Corinth and Aegina, also played important roles. What had begun as a desperate coalition of rival states was now fighting together against the greatest empire of the age. From a position overlooking the battle, Xerxes reportedly watched as his fleet was thrown into disorder. By the end of the fighting, the Persians had suffered a major defeat. Salamis changed the course of the invasion. Xerxes still possessed a powerful army, and Persia remained vastly stronger than any individual Greek city-state. But without secure naval superiority, maintaining such a large force deep inside hostile Greek territory became increasingly dangerous. Xerxes withdrew much of his army and returned to Asia, leaving a substantial force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The war was not yet over. The following year, in 479 BC, Mardonius attempted to separate Athens from the Greek alliance by offering favorable terms. The Athenians refused. Persian forces again occupied Attica, forcing the Athenians to evacuate their city for a second time. But now the Greeks prepared for a decisive confrontation on land. A large allied army, led by the Spartan commander Pausanias, moved into central Greece. Near the city of Plataea, the Greeks faced Mardonius and the remaining Persian army. The battle was confused, with both armies maneuvering for favorable positions and struggling with supply lines. Eventually, however, major sections of the armies collided. The disciplined Greek hoplites proved devastating in close combat. Mardonius was killed, Persian resistance collapsed, and much of the surviving army retreated north. At approximately the same period, Greek forces also won a major victory against Persian forces at Mycale, on the coast of Anatolia. The Great Invasion had failed. In only a few years, the Greeks had experienced both catastrophe and extraordinary victory. Athens had been captured and burned. Leonidas and the defenders at Thermopylae had been destroyed. Yet Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale demonstrated that the Persian Empire could be defeated. No single city-state could claim the victory alone. Sparta's military reputation and leadership had been essential. Athens had provided the naval power that made Salamis possible. Plataeans, Corinthians, Aeginetans, Thespians, and soldiers and sailors from numerous other Greek communities had contributed to the resistance. But the consequences of victory would not be shared equally. Sparta remained the greatest land power in Greece, but it had little interest in building a vast maritime empire across the Aegean. Athens, on the other hand, emerged from the war with an enormous fleet, experienced sailors, growing confidence, and unprecedented prestige. The city itself had been devastated, but the Athenians rebuilt. They strengthened their defenses and constructed massive walls connecting Athens with its ports. Most importantly, they began taking a leading role in the continuing struggle against Persia. In 478 BC, Athens and numerous Greek states, particularly those around the Aegean, formed an alliance known today as the Delian League. Its treasury was originally kept on the sacred island of Delos. Members contributed ships or money, supposedly to continue the war against Persia and protect Greek communities from future attack. Athens became the League's dominant power. Over time, what had begun as an alliance would increasingly resemble an Athenian empire. Some member states attempted to leave and discovered that Athens would not allow them to do so. Tribute flowed toward Athenian control. The fleet expanded. A city that had nearly been destroyed by Persia was becoming one of the richest and most powerful states in the Mediterranean. That transformation would reshape Athens itself. The wealth of empire would help fund magnificent temples, festivals, art, and public works. Athenian democracy would reach its most developed form. Philosophers, playwrights, historians, architects, and politicians would make Athens the intellectual and cultural center of the Greek world. Within only a few decades of its destruction, the Acropolis would rise again, crowned by one of the most famous buildings ever constructed, the Parthenon. The age that followed would become remembered as the Golden Age of Athens. But Athenian power came at a price. As Athens transformed its alliance into an empire, other Greeks increasingly viewed its ambitions with suspicion. And no city was more concerned than Sparta. The alliance that had defeated Persia was beginning to fracture. Soon the two greatest powers in Greece would turn their weapons against each other. In the decades following the Persian Wars, Athens entered the greatest period of prosperity in its history. The Delian League had originally been created to defend the Greek world against Persia, but Athens increasingly transformed the alliance into an empire. Tribute from allied states flowed into Athenian hands, while its enormous navy gave the city unprecedented power across the Aegean. At the center of this new Athens stood Pericles, one of the most influential statesmen of the 5th century BC. Under his leadership, democracy expanded, and Athens invested enormous resources into rebuilding the city. The Acropolis was transformed by monumental construction, most famously the Parthenon, a vast temple dedicated to Athena that became a symbol of Athenian wealth and power. Athens also became the intellectual center of the Greek world. Playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides produced tragedies that explored war, morality, fate, and human nature, while Aristophanes became famous for comedy. Historians such as Herodotus attempted to explain the events of the past, and philosophers increasingly questioned traditional ideas about politics, knowledge, and the universe. But the brilliance of Athens concealed a growing problem. Its prosperity depended partly upon an empire that many other Greeks increasingly resented. Members of the Delian League who attempted to leave could be forced back into the alliance. Athens demanded tribute, interfered in the affairs of other states, and used its navy to maintain its dominance. Sparta watched this expansion with growing concern. The two cities represented very different visions of Greek power. Athens possessed a maritime empire, supported by its fleet and democracy. Sparta dominated a network of allies on land and remained the greatest military power in Greece. For decades, tension grew between them. Eventually, diplomacy failed. In 431 BC, Athens and Sparta went to war. The conflict would last for nearly 3 decades, draw much of the Greek world into the fighting, devastate entire regions, and destroy the balance of power created after the Persian Wars. The Peloponnesian War had begun. In 431 BC, the Greek world descended into war. On one side stood Athens, supported by its powerful navy and maritime empire. On the other stood Sparta and its allies, whose armies dominated warfare on land. What followed was a brutal struggle that would last nearly 3 decades. Athens initially avoided confronting the Spartan army directly. Under Pericles, the population of Attica withdrew behind the city's walls while the Athenian fleet attacked enemy territory by sea. But the crowded city soon suffered catastrophe. A devastating plague swept through Athens, killing thousands, including Pericles himself. Despite the disaster, Athens continued fighting. The war spread across the Greek world as both sides sought new allies and advantages. In 415 BC, Athens made its most disastrous decision, launching an enormous expedition against Syracuse in Sicily. The campaign ended in catastrophe. Much of the Athenian fleet was destroyed, thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, and the city's military strength was severely weakened. Sparta now gained the advantage. With Persian financial support, the Spartans constructed a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. In 405 BC, the Spartan commander Lysander destroyed the remaining Athenian fleet at Aegospotami. Athens could no longer import the food necessary to sustain its population. Surrounded and starving, the city surrendered in 404 BC, The Athenian Empire was dismantled, its defenses were partially destroyed, and Sparta became the dominant power in Greece. But victory did not bring stability. Decades of warfare had exhausted the Greek city-states. Sparta struggled to maintain its dominance, while Athens eventually recovered some of its influence. Thebes also rose to challenge Spartan power, defeating its army at Leuctra in 371 BC. The Greek world had become trapped in an endless struggle for supremacy. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes continued competing against one another, never realizing that a new power was rising beyond their northern frontier. It was the kingdom of Macedon, and under an ambitious king named Philip II, it would accomplish what generations of Greek city-states had failed to do. It would bring Greece under a single dominant power. By the middle of the 4th century BC, decades of warfare had left the Greek city-states divided and exhausted. To the north, however, the kingdom of Macedon was becoming stronger. Under Philip II, the Macedonian army was transformed into one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world. Philip expanded his kingdom southward and increasingly interfered in Greek affairs. In 338 BC, his forces defeated an alliance led by Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea, establishing Macedonian dominance over most of Greece. Philip planned to invade the Persian Empire, but in 336 BC, he was assassinated. The throne passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Within only a few years, Alexander accomplished what would once have seemed impossible. He crossed into Asia, defeated the armies of the Persian king Darius III, conquered Egypt, captured the great Persian capitals, and continued eastward toward India. By his death in Babylon in 323 BC, Alexander had created one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. His empire quickly fractured among his generals, but Greek culture spread throughout the territories he had conquered. Greek became a major language of government, trade, scholarship, and literature across much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities such as Alexandria became centers where Greek traditions mixed with Egyptian, Persian, and other cultures, beginning the Hellenistic age. The political independence of the classical Greek city-states would never fully return to what it had once been. But their influence survived far beyond their military power. Greek philosophy shaped generations of thinkers. Greek architecture influenced buildings for thousands of years. Greek literature, theater, mathematics, science, history, and political thought became foundations upon which later civilizations would build. Even Rome, which eventually conquered the Greek world, absorbed enormous amounts of Greek culture. Ancient Greece had begun as a collection of scattered communities emerging from the ruins of the Bronze Age. Those communities never created a lasting, unified Greek empire. Instead, they created something far more enduring. Ideas that would outlive them.